How are you doing this morning? This has been a great conference, it really has. And so I'm very happy to be here in the role of introducer for a friend and colleague, Carol Tilley. Carol Tilley is an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois. She studies the intersection of young people, comics, and libraries, particularly in the United States during the mid-20th century. Her research on anti-comics advocate Fredric Wertham was featured in the New York Times and other media outlets. An in-demand speaker on the history of comics readership and libraries, Tilley was a 2016 Will Eisner Comics Industry Awards judge and currently serves as a vice president, president-elect, hey, something we have in common, of the Comics Studies Society. Carol is also a native of Indiana. She's from Vivi, and so it's with great pleasure. Please help me welcome Carol Tilley.
Thank you, Steve. Oops. It's a bit cliched, especially for people like me who work in comic studies. But I always like to include a little bit about my origin story whenever I give a talk. It helps me acknowledge the ground on which I stand of connecting the personal with the professional. And although I'll share bits of this throughout my talk, let me start here. So Steve mentioned I'm a native of Indiana. And I was born and raised in Vivi, which is starred on the map. It's not that far. It's only about 100 miles from Indianapolis, but you would have thought it, would have taken 3 or 4 weeks to get here when I was a kid, because it's a little bit cut off with the hills and the river. I was really fortunate because as a kid growing up, I lived on the same block as the public library in town, and you can see that library on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And I thought it was some sort of kismet because the public library and my parents' house were the only two buildings in town that had this same wire-cut dark red brick and the same red Spanish tile roofs. So I assumed from an early age that there was this link between the library and me. And I was there every day it was open during the week from about age 3 all the way through high school. But on Saturdays, I would walk a block further and I would go to the corner drugstore, Sullivan's Pharmacy, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen. It's now the visitor's center in town. And I would sit on the cold tile floor and read comics. And occasionally, I would buy some as well. Now, as a kid, I loved newspaper strips, newspaper editorial cartoons, and comic books like Richie Rich and Archie. And I grew up to be a comics geek. I've owned that fully. But I am not as much of a comics geek as your own Steve Kelly, who, as you can see, came out to you all last year as having 35 to 40,000 comics in his basement. I can't compete with that. I really can't. And I told Steve I was going to say something about that, so he was prepared for me to give him a hard time. Now, because I primarily teach courses that are aimed at young people courses that are aimed at people who want to work with young people in school and public libraries, a lot of my thinking about comics is aimed at the nexus of comics and kids and libraries. And it's a phenomenal time in comics publishing to be someone who works with kids and teens, because about a third of contemporary comics and graphic novels are aimed exclusively at young people. That's been a big change since I was growing up in the early 70s. Raina Telgemeier, who is the creator of a variety of acclaimed titles, including Drama and Smile, that have legions of elementary-aged girl fans, last year sold more than 1.3 million copies of her books in a single year. She accounted for something like 5 to 6% of all comics sold in the US, just her. And Jean Luen Yang, the author of American-Born Chinese and the co-creator of the Secret Coders series that you see here on the screen, was named a MacArthur Fellow last year. These are things that 25 years ago, when I became a librarian, were largely unimaginable. Now, in public and school libraries across the US, there has been extraordinary growth in comics collections and in programming, aimed at young people as well as adults. And much of this has been aided by a corollary growth in acquisitions and readers' advisory resources and the movement of comics readers into the library profession. Plus, librarians are finding, regardless of what kind of library that they're in, that putting comics in their collections makes for some significant growth in circulation and library use. Today, though, I want to focus on issues that are more relevant to academic and special librarians, as well as issues more relevant to technical services. That said, libraries share common threads, regardless of who they serve, and technical services and public services have a symbiotic relationship. So whatever sort of library you work in or service position you hold, I think you'll find something for you in this talk. I'll still draw in part on examples from young people's relationship with comics over the past century to help me articulate concepts of access, intellectual freedom, public good, and the role of libraries. My focus will be on US libraries and comics published in the US, but please know that comics are not just a US phenomenon. Whatever your starting point, I hope you will leave today's talk with a heightened enthusiasm for comics as a rich portion of our cultural heritage here in the US. I hope, too, that you'll understand how much librarians and archivists have ahead of them in terms of work with comics. Now, a quick note. I use the term comics to refer to everything from newspaper comic strips to Japanese manga, from floppy comic books to graphic novels, from web comics to hybrid format picture books. All of those things are comics to me. And with that in mind, I want to start with the good news. Some of the markers of progress, some good things that libraries and librarians have accomplished with regard to comics. Now, some of you, I suspect, will be at ALA in a couple of weeks, and you've been in the past few years, and if you have been there, you will know that in the past decade, the American Library Association has really brought comics and graphic novel programming to the forefront. So at this year's conference, for instance, there is a full day of panels focused on comics. There is an artist alley with a couple of dozen comics creators who will be set up selling their wares. They are co-hosting, the American Library Association is co-hosting programs regularly now at the New York Comic-Con and the Chicago Comics and Entertainment Expo. There's a member interest group on comics, and almost all of this has happened in the past 8 to 10 years. There are academic libraries with extensive and long-standing comics-related special collections, including the especially noteworthy Michigan State and Ohio State. Now, Michigan State, and you can see Randy Scott here holding some comics, has been collecting comics since the 1970s. They now have more than 200,000 comics and an extensive collection of related materials from the US and abroad. Now, Ohio State, and you see a photo of the stacks here with Caitlin McGurk, is home to the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum, which got its start in 1977. They now hold more than 300,000 pieces of original comics art, along with lots of books and serials. Beyond that, they also have 70,000 linear feet of comics-related manuscript materials. There are other academic libraries, including ones at Bowling Green, at San Diego State, Indiana University, as well as the Library of Congress, which also have extensive comics-related collections. Some academic libraries have established digital special collections of comics. So you see here a couple of instances. One, the University of Nebraska, which has a 200-plus item digital collection of government and industry-produced comics. It's one I use frequently. And then Catholic University in Washington, D.C. provides digital access to more than 30 years' worth of the Catholic-focused treasure chest comics. And if you have never had a chance to read treasure chest comics, I would suggest it. They're kind of fun. Instead of superheroes and adventure stories, you get the tortured lives of saints, which I think is kind of lovely in its own special, weird way. Now, other libraries have begun specialized physical collections. At my home institution, University of Illinois, we now have the largest collection of Indian and South Asian comics anywhere. And that's thanks to the efforts of Mara Thacker, who you see here in the photo, who travels to India and will be going to Bangladesh soon and goes on buying trips. And one of the things that Mara has told me is that there are Indian scholars who are coming to University of Illinois to use our Indian and South Asian comics collection because there are no libraries in India that have these materials. So they are coming to the US to use their own national cultural heritage materials. At University of Michigan, librarian Dave Carter has been building a specialized collection focusing on mini comics or small press comics, which are typically do-it-yourself, low print run materials. They're the things that aren't easily found in catalogs like Ingram or Baker and Taylor. Now, libraries of all kinds are now taking advantage of digital tools and resources that have strong comics-related content. For instance, Alexander Street has an excellent digital collection of underground comics from the 1960s and 70s, along with digital copies of the long-running Comics Journal. Hoopla and other e-material platforms give patrons access to digital comics, and resources such as Novelist help provide readers guidance on what to read next. These are all tools I wish I would have had 20 years ago. And of course, there's now decent support from jobbers like Ingram to help librarians add comics to their collections, something, again, that was unimaginable until the last decade. Booklist, Choice, and other review journals recommend comics and comics-adjacent materials. H.W. Wilson has come out with a collection guide for comics and graphic novels. And comics distributor Diamond has a dedicated librarian website and magazine. Now, I would also be remiss not to mention the Library of Congress, which, as the U.S. Copyright Depository Institution, has the largest publicly accessible collection of comics in the world, along with a collection of some original comics art. So if you ever find yourself in DC, make an appointment with Sarah Duke or Georgia Higley and take a look at some of the beautiful things they have. In the last few years, they've also been working to collect materials from creators at Maryland's Small Press Expo, or SPX. And I think with Dr. Carla Hayden at the helm, comics will have an increasingly bright future at LC. As libraries have built out their comics collections, their institution's academic courses have also begun to include comics as texts in classes or as the focus of classes. And so, for instance, I'm going back to my home institution, University of Illinois. One can find comics-related content in courses from departments including Gender and Women's Studies, Comparative Literature, Rhetoric, Education, East Asian Languages and Cultures, History, Art and Design, and, of course, my home department, Library and Information Science. This is part 2 of my origin story. At Illinois, I'm fortunate enough to get to teach 2 comics-focused classes. One is Comics in Libraries, I've only offered it once, although I do hope to offer it again soon. The other, I've offered every spring and a few summers for the last 7 years, and that's Comics Readers Advisory. That has filled with students each of the 9 times that I've taught it. It draws students from across the school, students who are interested in academic librarianship, public librarianship, data science, special collections, youth services, and more. Now, not all, but many of my students come to this class comics readers like I am. And even though they have chosen to take a class that is clearly focused on comics, many of them still feel guilty about enjoying comics and know that in the libraries where they end up working, they may still have to justify purchasing and programming with comics. For that reason, I've started telling my students a simple truth about why comics matter, about why comics belong in libraries. And it's this: comics tell stories and communicate ideas. They are part of our cultural heritage, and they have been for decades. And yet, the first positive, sustained discussion anywhere in the library literature focused on helping librarians make the case for comics, for helping them understand how comics publishing works, for dealing with descriptive issues. That conversation happened only 20 years ago, 19 years actually, in the pages of Serial's Librarian. It was 1998 when those 3 comics-focused issues of Serial's Librarian appeared. I'm glad they exist, but I want you to think about something. In 1998, it had already been 12 years since Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse had been published. It had already been 12 years since Frank Miller's influential Batman: The Dark Knight Returns was published. It had been 12 years since Alan Moore's equally influential Watchmen was published. Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out For, which helped me navigate my own coming out as gay, was already 15 years into its run in 1998. Those Serial's Librarian issues came 20 years after the publication of Will Eisner's groundbreaking book, A Contract with God and Other Tenement Stories, which was one of the first to carry the moniker graphic novel. 1998 was 30 years after Bob Crumb peddled the first issue of his underground masterpiece, Zap Comics, in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood of San Francisco. 1998 was 46 years after Mad, which started as a comic book, but burst onto the scene and began inspiring a generation of cartoonists such as Art Spiegelman, readers like me, and even perhaps paving the way for media like The Daily Show today. 1998 was 57 years after the world met Wonder Woman, the Amazonian princess who came to teach the world the value of loving submission. 1941 was also the year the world met a bumbling red-headed teen named Archie Andrews. It was also, amazingly, the year that Stan Lee began as an editor at the company that we now know today as Marvel Comics. 1998 was 68 years after a squeaky-voiced mouse named Mickey began his run as a daily comic strip. 1998 was 85 years after George Harriman began dazzling readers, including the poet E.E. Cummings, and much, much later, Bill Watterson of Calvin and Hobbes fame, with his colloquial comic Crazy Cat. And that comic proves even today that a cat, a mouse, and a brick can provide nearly endless entertainment and amusement. Those issues of Serial's Librarian came 96 years after Buster Brown debuted, inspiring page boy haircuts, and providing inspiration for both Buster Brown shoes and what we now today call Mary Janes. It was 109 years after Henry Jackson Lewis, born a slave in Mississippi a few decades earlier, began a gig as the cartoonist for the Indianapolis Freeman, one of the country's premier African-American newspapers. And 1998 was 156 years after the debut of the US publication of the Swiss comic Monsieur Vieux-Bois, known here as The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck. Now, I mention these publications, these distances, because between some notable comics and the issues of Serial's librarian, because I think it's important to understand that until those articles appeared, librarians had done a credible job of trying to pretend, sometimes even wishing, with all their might, that comics didn't exist. It was in the 1890s that Hearst launched the first newspaper comics supplement for the New York Journal. He billed it as 8 pages of iridescent polychromous effulgence that makes the rainbow look like a lead pipe. And it did. And of course, the comic supplements in those early newspapers had commercial aims. Colorful, playful images draw in readers and sell newspapers. At the same time, in the pages of Hearst's papers and those across the US, the colored comic supplements on Sundays became incubators for innovative storytelling and design. As syndication practices developed in the first decade of the 20th century, newspaper comics became an early source for water cooler conversations. People across the US could converse about the antics of Mutt and Jeff or the Katzenjammer Kids, helping create a coherent national culture. Many librarians weren't fans of newspaper comics. Between 1905 and 1915, for instance, one can find recurring complaints about the evils of the Sunday supplements. Some librarians refused to put out the comics with the rest of the Sunday newspapers because they didn't care for the contents. Even more so, they found that the readers who came to look at the comics messed things up, were too noisy, too boisterous, and they didn't like that either. Some librarians in these early articles even bragged about tossing the Sunday comics in the library's furnaces, and save everyone the trouble of looking at them. Newspaper comic strips continued to grow in popularity and number, and by the late 1920s, the comics section was, for both adults and kids, the most frequently read portion of daily newspapers across the country. The publisher, Couples and Leon, knew how much people enjoyed comics, like Little Orphan Annie. And so beginning in 1904, they repackaged popular strips as 50-page hardbound books. They issued more than 100 of these. Between 1904 and 1933, Couples and Leon sold 35 million copies of these strip reprints. Still, librarians resisted comics, as they did with most light materials. Sales and popularity, quite frankly, be damned. Comics may have been perceived as especially pernicious for children, but adults didn't need to read them either. The late 1920s and early 1930s were a time of experimentation with visual storytelling. For instance, artist Lynd Ward created several wordless novels in woodcut, inspired by the work of European artists, including Franz Masereel and Otto Nuckel. Ward's books met with some critical acclaim for his efforts, but libraries seem not to have collected them widely. And they certainly didn't spend a lot of time collecting Milt Gross's parody wordless novel, He Done Her Wrong. Influential Pittsburgh library director, and who I like to think of as a perpetual curmudgeon, Ralph Munn, summed up many librarians' resistance to providing materials like Couples and Leon books or the Milk Gross wordless novels to patrons. I love this, so I'm going to read this out loud. It's too beautiful. That the taxpayer has a right to what he wants is an argument often heard, yet it has also been pointed out that tax-supported art galleries do not feature comic strips, and municipal band concerts are not given over entirely to jazz. Nor, in my opinion, are tax-supported public libraries compelled to devote a considerable part of their energies and funds to distributing second-rate novels, simply because part of the tax-paying public want them. He repeated this argument a number of times, but this is my favorite instance of it. Floppy comic books arrived on the scene in the early 1930s, and in the first decade or so, there was no convention about what should appear in the pages, about what they should include, or even what they should be, or who they were for. So some publishers played with things like book reviews for kids, which often encourage kids to go find the books at their public libraries. They included movie reviews, writing contests, and even in some titles, cartooning contests. But neither those features, nor the introduction of original characters like Superman, could keep literary critic Sterling North from complaining that comics were badly written and badly printed. They were a strain on young eyes and young nervous systems. The effect of these pulp paper nightmares is a violent stimulant. The crude blacks and reds spoil the child's native sense of color. Their hypodermic injection of sex and murder make the child impatient with better, though quieter, stories. Now, I mention Sterling North and this criticism of comics for one particular reason. And that is that only a year before he wrote this editorial that was reprinted in newspapers across the country, that was reprinted as a standalone handout and distributed in libraries and schools across the country. He had served on the 3-member committee appointed by the American Library Association that helped to draft the library's Bill of Rights, which launched our profession's commitment to intellectual freedom. Comic books found quick purchase among young readers in 1940. And in 1940, when many schools lacked libraries, and a third or more of young people lacked public library access, comics were already outselling kids' books by a margin of 5 to 1. That's pretty amazing. That's in terms of dollars. So the average kids' book in 1940, that was $1.50 to $2. And the average comic was 10 cents, although there were some that were only a nickel. And so you're looking at $10 million in sales in 1940 for comics and only about $2 million for traditional children's books. Throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, more than 95% of all young people, children and teens, read comics. It didn't matter whether you were a boy or a girl, whether you were rich or poor, whether you were black or white or brown, or you were like this young man who was housed in one of the Japanese internment camps. If you were under the age of 18, you read comics. And it wasn't just that you read an occasional issue. For a lot of kids, they were reading maybe 20 to 30 different comics titles regularly. And not only that, they were reading an equal number of comic strips in daily and Sunday newspapers. This was a lot of reading. And it wasn't just kids. More than 60% of adults read comic books too. Now, rather than working to capture some of this excitement around comic books and comic strips, many librarians actually actively worked against the medium. This is one of my favorite article titles. Jean Grey Harker, at the point that she wrote this, was no longer a librarian, although she had worked as one. And she actually encouraged librarians in this article that they should work with their state and national legislators to find ways of restricting the sale of comics to young people. Now, in all fairness, plenty of adults found comics irritating. It wasn't just Jean Grey, it wasn't just Sterling North. Others, like librarian Elizabeth Hunter, viewed comics in a more pathological manner, that comic book reading was like a childhood disease. She says, a severe case of comics often leaves a serious aftermath of disinterest and disability in other reading. The antidote is not good comics. There are no good comics. Now, undoubtedly, this led some adults to encourage kids to bundle up their favorite reading materials and toss them into bonfires. There were at least 100 public comics burnings in the late 1940s in the US, all across the country. Some kids, like Roy Thomas, who grew up to be an editor for Marvel magazine, an editor and writer, were a little bit smarter about things. Roy took his comics to one of the bonfires in Missouri, and he dutifully tossed them in like all of the other kids were doing, except, first of all, he only took comics that he didn't care about. And second of all, he waited until people started leaving, and then he started pulling some comics out of the fire to take home with him. Now, this widespread disdain, coupled by the observation that almost all of the young people he treated, encouraged psychiatrist Fredric Wertham to take up the study of comics in 1947. Wertham had been, from the 1930s, a psychiatrist who worked in the New York hospital system. He spent a lot of time working with criminals, finding ways of assisting them as they worked through mental health programs in the city. And in the 1940s, he set up a couple of clinics. One, notably, was called the Lafargue Clinic. And the Lafargue Clinic was the first psychiatric service to be available to people in Harlem, to people of color, both Latinx and African American. He charged a quarter for you to come. He had a team of volunteer social workers and psychologists and psychiatrists and others who worked with people who needed assistance. And as he began to treat folks at this clinic and elsewhere in his practice, he noticed that, as I said, that kids were reading comics. And something about that triggered him. It's still not really clear to me what happened, but in late 1947 and then into early 1948, comics and railing against the evils of comics became his primary professional goal. And so throughout the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, Frederic Wertham was everywhere. He was on the radio, he was on TV, he was in newspapers, he was in women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping. In Reader's Digest, he spoke at professional associations, he spoke at library and teacher gatherings, and all of this was about the evils of comics. He synthesized his ideas that comics are vicious, that comics are violent, that comics will create readers who are maladjusted in his 1954 book, Seduction of the Innocent. This book was a true polemic. It was, well, it is still, you can pick up a copy and read it. It's hyperbolic, it's frenzied, and he draws in this book on what he says are case studies, clinical case studies of the young people that he treated. He advocates in this book to restrict the sale of what he calls violent comics to anyone, to not allow anyone under the age of 13 to read these comics. The only problem is that for Wertham, 90% of comics, he said, were violent. So those Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck comics, Superman, Batman, Western comics Science fiction comics, fantasy comics, jungle comics, all of those were, to his mind, violent. There was pretty much nothing safe. Now, he did make a distinction for newspaper comics. Those were okay, he said, because he believed that they had editors who kept the worst content out. This book was reviewed in places like the New York Times and in Library Quarterly. Bruno Bettelheim, another psychiatrist, reviewed it for Library Quarterly. The reviews were largely positive. C. Wright Mills, writing in the New York Times, said it was a most important book. The National Education Association named it the most important book of the year and encouraged teachers and parents and librarians to read it. It got a lot of traction. And in part, it was because almost simultaneous with the publication of this book, Wertham appeared as an expert witness before a public hearing of the United States Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. And this committee had been impaneled to investigate the link between comics and other mass media and juvenile delinquency. This wasn't the first time that comics had been sort of targeted by a Senate hearing. There had been hearings in 1950 that looked at comics and pornography and racketeering. There had been various state hearings across the country. There had been local and municipal attempts to regulate the sale of comics. But the Senate hearings, which were occurring about the same time as the Army McCarthy hearings, were quite captivating. They brought in comics publishers and expert witnesses like Wertham, although he was perhaps on the stand the longest of any of the experts. Now, the kids who read comics were not so likely to be juvenile delinquents as they were simply to be ordinary kids. Some of them, like Bob Stewart, who's pictured here at about age 15, used their fascination with comics to launch self-published fanzines, which they distributed to small networks of readers throughout the US. I got to know Bob late in life. He died a couple of years ago. He went on to work in the comics business as a critic, as a historian. He reviewed comics and graphic novels for Publishers Weekly. He wrote a wonderful biography of EC Comics creator Wally Wood. And when he was a teen, creating this fanzine and others, he was working with kids his age from across the country. Bill Spicer, whose artwork you can see on the cover here, has grown up to be a comics historian. One of the contributors and subscribers to the EC Fan Bulletin is one of my intellectual heroes, Tom Inge, who is perhaps the modern founder of comic studies in academia. And so there were, 24 kids who were reading this. And Bob wasn't the only young person doing this. This was something that was happening in communities across the country. Now, a lot of these kids who adults were worried were becoming juvenile delinquents were also taking the time to write the Senate in hopes of keeping their beloved comics safe. I found in the National Archives more than 400 letters, probably about 600 names in all because some of them have multiple signatures, from kids probably ages 9 to 18 and some adults who wrote letters to the Senate committee describing their love for comics, telling the senators that they were not juvenile delinquents, that they read comics because the stories were good and because the artwork was good, and because they were topics, they were characters that they found captivating. And they begged the Senate not to restrict the sale of comics. Now, it turns out that their efforts really mattered little because comics publishers were eager to stave off any potential government intervention. And so they created that same year their own editorial body to censor comics content. That body was called the Comics Code Authority. And then it existed from 1954 until 2011. In order for a comic to be sold on the newsstand, you had to, and that was in the 1950s and 60s, the primary way of selling comics. You had to submit your artwork and stories, your original pages, to the Comics Code Authority. And there, they had hired a band of retired librarians and teachers, so truly little white-haired ladies, who would sit in the office and stare at your pages, and then they had a little well over in one corner with ink and whiteout and whatever was the 1950s and 60s equivalent of whiteout. And you would go over there and fix things while you were there. And eventually, you would get this stamp of approval on the pages of your, on the cover of your comic. That was the only way you could get a comic distributed. Now, the problem was the Comics Code Authority, which again was created by the publishers, but it was created by a particular segment of publishers, and so really worked to squelch a lot of creativity in the industry. The Comics Code Authority restricted stories, for instance, that included vampires and werewolves and zombies. I don't know if any of you have been Walking Dead fans, but if The Walking Dead, you know, that couldn't have existed as a comic story in the 1950s and 60s. You couldn't show people who were divorced. You couldn't show criminals get away with their criminal behavior. You couldn't show kids being disrespectful to authority. You couldn't include too much slang or too much poor grammar unless it was absolutely necessary. They didn't want to see people who had physical disabilities represented in the comics. They didn't want to see women really either, unless they were essential to the story and fully and appropriately attired. There was a whole, you know, huge list of things. And over the years, over the decades the Comics Code Authority existed, things changed in the way comics were distributed, and so it became less relevant, and they also sort of made the code less onerous over time. But going back to 1954. So in 1954, we have Wertham's book that comes out that argued for age-restricted comic sales. We had federal public hearings about the evils of comics, and we had the creation of an industry censorship body. All of that happened in a 6-month period. And so surely the American Library Association had something to say about all this. They didn't. I've looked through archives, I've looked through bulletins for the ALA. The library profession as a whole was pretty contented to watch the contraction and restrictions on the comics industry from afar. I suppose that shouldn't be a surprise. As Robert Lee noted in a 1951 article about the public library inquiry, he said, quote, "Comics, which are the real bestseller for children, were almost completely unrepresented in the library collections." So I suppose if libraries didn't collect comics, then why be concerned about them when they're threatened with regulation, when they're threatened with restrictions? And so for the next 30 years, comics mostly disappeared from librarians' public concerns. Occasionally, one might find a brief article or a news note in a professional journal, for instance, suggesting that libraries could reach teens by adding comics to their collections. That didn't happen very often, only a couple of times. Or providing contact information for underground comics publishers in case your library wanted to spend 50 cents or $1 picking up a couple of items for its collection. At some point in those intervening years, librarians began to buy books about comics. Enough so that in 1991, Keith DeCandido occasioned to write that perhaps librarians would eventually start spending some money on the stuff that those books were written about. So we were buying stuff about comics, but we weren't buying comics. And thus we come to part 3 of my origin story. With a newly minted MLS, I took a job as a school librarian here in the Indianapolis area in 1993. This comic, Larry Gonick's The Cartoon History of the Universe, was the single comic in my library's 15,000 volume collection. I bought a few more comics for that library during the time I was there, but more important, I started thinking about why weren't there comics? Why weren't there comics in my school library where I was working? Why weren't there comics in my childhood public library? Why did I spend so much time in my childhood public library, but I had to go to the drugstore to get this thing that I was also excited to read? And when I went back to school to work on my doctorate, I kept thinking about those questions. And after a long, strange journey, I finally decided to think about those questions in a sustained way for my dissertation. In the 10 years that I have been a faculty member at the University of Illinois, I've continued to think about those questions still. And it's been a privilege for me to be able to be promoted and tenured as an LIS faculty member almost solely on my comics research. This is something, again, as a practicing librarian 20-some years ago, I could never have imagined. Now, in that pondering and research in the last 10 years, I ended up in the papers of Fredric Wertham, The Seduction of the Innocent Guy. They had been at the Library of Congress since about his death in 1980, but they were not opened to the public until 2010. And I went there not because I wanted to do Frederic Wertham's legacy any more harm. He's been made the whipping boy for lots of the evils that have been perpetrated against comics, some of it deserved and others not. I went there, though, to read the correspondence that he claimed to have had with teachers and librarians. But it was within the first day that I knew I was going to leave from my time at Library of Congress with a much bigger story. That is, he made stuff up. In 2012, I published a boring scholarly article. This is an example of scholarly communication. You know, it works right. You get this article out, and then a news story comes out, and everything blows up. It's every scholar's dream. Truly. I wrote this story about his falsifications. I didn't want to. I actually put it off for a while. I spent, really a full year debating whether or not I wanted to tell this story. But I ultimately decided it was important for me to write about Wertham, to write about these falsifications, because he abused the trust that his young patients placed in him. It was important because Fredric Wertham's distaste for comics and his campaign against them is a big part of why it took until 1998 for librarians to start thinking about comics in a serious way. It's Wertham's specter that keeps my students, my pre-professional library students, second guessing about whether it's okay to like comics. It turns out that my work seemed to be important to a lot of other folks. It's opened a lot of doors for me professionally to speak to people, to audiences, including folks like you, about the world of comics. And it's also been a vindication of sort for a lot of comics readers and comics creators, knowing that maybe they haven't wasted their life. Now, I'm really, really happy that we are finally figuring out the whole comics and libraries thing. But at the same time, we need to recognize that we're really, really late. As robust as comic sales are today, and you can't miss the hype around movies like Guardians of the Galaxy and around the new Wonder Woman movie, which is awesome, by the way. And even though comics is big business in terms of the marketing and the tie-ins and the cross-promotion. We are nowhere near the unit sales that we were for comics in 1953. We have missed peak popularity. So by way of comparison, and this is proportionally accurate, the image on the left represents the per person sales of comics in 1953. Well, per person for young people sales. It was about 32 or 33 comics per school-aged child per year in 1953. Today, it's somewhere under 3. We don't know exactly who is buying comics. The readership and sales statistics are not very good about that, but when we just look at the numbers, we know that sales overall have shrunk. Now, thankfully for us, while we as a profession were busy ignoring comics, while we were busy hoping that comics might just go away, comics fans helped save us from ourselves. This is Bill Blackbeard, and between the late 1950s and until his death in around 2006, Bill Blackbeard collected tons, literal tons. This isn't metaphoric. This is, something like 30 tons or so of cast-off newspapers from libraries across the country because he loved comics. He understood what so many libraries didn't, that comics have unique cultural value and were worthy of historical study. Yet he knew there was no way of accomplishing that study because there were no indexes to newspaper comics, that sometimes libraries had not even bound the comics sections with the rest of the newspapers, in part because they probably tossed them in the furnace. Other libraries were disposing of their bound newspapers as they microfilmed them. And that includes the Library of Congress to some extent. But Bill Blackbeard also understood that all of the microfilming that libraries did throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s had limitations. That microfilming didn't show color. Microfilming is a low fidelity solution for the high fidelity medium of comics. And so, for instance, if we only had microfilmed versions of Sunday comics, we would experience something like this. For this Lionel Feininger comics page from 1906. In these early years, artists like Feininger worked for only one paper. So this was only the Chicago Tribune that carried his comics. This is a beautiful strip called The Kinderkids. And Feininger was a German artist who did a lot of other fine arts work, including sculpture, throughout his career. But for a while in the early 20th century, he drew comics. And so if you were to encounter one of his pages, which would have been on the huge broadside sheet, not like today's comics that are squinched into the smallest space possible, it would look like this instead of this. The color, the detail, the text, the ability to interrogate printing methods, all of that is lost when we only have a microfilmed or black and white digitized record. Plus, many early newspaper comics, as I said, were printed in only one newspaper. And what happens if the newspaper morgue or the library's collection is incomplete? We don't get them at all. We aren't able to see them. And I want to say that even with this Feininger example, I had to make it up. I had to create this image because when you search a resource like ProQuest and their historical newspaper collections, there is no comics section for this date in their digitized record. So if Bill Blackbeard hadn't been saving those comics, we might not know today that something this beautiful exists. Science professor and comics fan Jerry Bales created a who's who of early writers, editors, and illustrators in the comics industry. He helped create the long-running fanzine Alter Ego with one-time Marvel editor Roy Thomas. Bales also helped launch Kappa Alpha, the Comics Amateur Press Association, which provided a starting point for serious criticism and study of comics. And that was around 1960. But perhaps most important, Jerry Bales photographed and microfilmed, with his own money, complete comics from the 1930s and 40s. He wanted to be able to share them with fellow comics fans because it was difficult to get copies of some of those early comics. And he knew that if people wanted to study comics, they had to have access to them. For more than 30 years, an extensive network of volunteers has indexed more than 1 million comics, creating the Grand Comics Database, which is a resource for fans, scholars, and librarians. And although it's still incomplete, it helps collect information about publishers, series, characters, creators in a relatively searchable format, so you can find the on-sale dates of a particular comic book issue or figure out where particular stories were reprinted. It's a resource I use almost every day. Volunteer fans have also created sites like the Digital Comics Museum, where people scan public domain comic books, upload them to the website. Most of these are not held widely in comics collections. You have to go to places like Michigan State in order to find them. But it's sites like this that allow scholars like me to trace reader participation in fan practice. And private collectors and fan researchers help make available glimpses into publishing practices by sharing their finds on places like Facebook and listservs. And this is an example that came across a Facebook group I participated in recently. What you see on the bottom left is a printing mock-up. So this would have been sent to the printer to create the engraving plate for a letters page in an old EC Comics from the 1950s. This was put up for sale. A friend of mine purchased this, and he decided to peel off the letter page from its cardboard backing. And what he found is what you see here in the background, covered with this mucilage. It's the handwritten, penciled story breakdown for another comic story in an EC comic. So by taking off this front page, he's able to see what goes into the creative practice, what goes into blocking out the story, how it might have changed over time. So what do we need to be doing in libraries with regard to comics? How can we, as people who are interested in preserving the record of cultural heritage that comics is, what can we be doing? There's plenty yet to be done. Those feel-good examples I shared at the beginning of the talk, the collections and the digital projects, those are a start. But many academic libraries are still not collecting comics to a significant degree. Not every library can be in Michigan State. But it's difficult to imagine that there's not something comics related, even if it's a decent reading collection that every library can collect. Now, quite honestly, it can be difficult to keep up with the volume that's produced. In the last few years, if you look at production statistics, there are about 800 to 900 new comics and graphic novels, trade collections that are published each month. 800 to 900. And those numbers don't even include some of the prolific variant formats in types such as mini comics, web comics, international albums, manga, locally produced comics, and comics distributed via Patreon and Kickstarter. Our descriptive cataloging, classification, and shelving practices around comics are still awkward. And I get it. Every library is different. Every set of patrons is different. Technical services and cataloging staff is overworked. And not everyone who is doing this work really gets comics or cares. And yet, I still have to think that there is room to do more. We can figure out, as folks did at San Diego State University when they all of a sudden got a donation of 40,000 comics, we can figure out how to break the rules effectively, how we can kludge together new practices and train people when we can on how comics work. And we can endeavor to make our collections more visible and more accessible. Our goal has to be creating intellectual and digital surrogates that people can use. And I don't even want to go in detail to a lot of the archival collections we've missed out on. If we were to look at libraries and archives across the country, there are probably less than 50 meaningful comics-focused manuscript collections in the US. That's not very many for as huge and diverse and rich a field as comics is. A lot of that material, publishing records, creators' correspondence, fan mail, original art, it was either tossed out or it was purchased by private collectors and may never see a library, may never be publicly accessible. So I would encourage all of you to think, what creators, what fans, what publishers should we begin courting? What materials do we need to be on the lookout for? Who is going to be the ransom center for comics creators? And no, it's not really reasonable for Ohio State and Michigan State to go on doing the heavy lifting. Most important, we need to force ourselves to go more firmly beyond the perception that comics are infantile, puerile drivel. The perception that Fredric Wertham helped consolidate. Comics studies is a robust and growing field. There have been theses, dissertations, and critiques of comics for more than 80 years. The Comic Studies Society, for which I'm president-elect, has nearly 500 members. And it's only been around for 2 years, so that's pretty amazing. And there are plenty more folks who do work with comics but may not be inclined to describe themselves or define themselves as comics scholars. Comics scholarship crosses disciplinary boundaries to include work in medicine, cognitive science, political theory, military history, art history, comparative literature, speech act theory, and curriculum studies, among them. Comics can be silly, absolutely, or serious. They can be fantastical, or they can be grounded in reality. Their creators and readers transcend boundaries of race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, nationality, style, format, and preferences. In a time when the digital divide is still real, when racism, sexism, and politics divide us, when libraries at all levels of all kinds fight for funding and struggle to maintain adequate services and collections, it can be tempting to think that comics remain ephemeral, that comics have waited 80+ years for us in the library world to care about them, so why not let them wait a little bit longer? But I would urge you all to remember, comics tell stories. Comics communicate ideas. They are an important, an invaluable, and indisputable part of our cultural heritage, and they belong to all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's take some questions from the audience. Raise your hand. Come on. Lisa.
Lisa's going to save you.
I'm not going to save anybody. So one thing you mentioned was making digital surrogates. Do you know of anybody aside from, I know Alexander Street Press has their database, and there are those other projects you mentioned. Do you know of any libraries that are trying to take a hand in doing that, working with any of the publishers? I mean, many of the publishers are now doing their current product themselves, digitizing it, but are you aware of any archiving projects?
No. I mean, outside of a couple of the examples I gave, you know, at Nebraska, at Catholic, at Virginia Commonwealth, and some other places that are doing small-scale digital projects, there hasn't been a lot of cooperation between extant comics publishers and libraries. And some comics publishers are still, quite frankly, confused about the library market and how it works. And even with a product like Hoopla, there are, you know, important publishers that are missing from coverage. The same with, what is it, iComics, which is another library product. And even with Comixology, but there aren't often, with something like the Marvel online collection, or with Comixology, there's not an institutional repository for it. And the coverage is certainly more aimed at current and recent or highly popular serials rather than sort of this vast assortment of stuff. I do know that Alexander Street has been looking at doing more collections. I know, for instance, that the Archie Comics collection is one that has been raised as a possibility recently. And that's an interesting one because Archie is such a ubiquitous part of kids' lives in the US, at least, you know, until the 1980s or so, and it's coming back again. And Archie has been around since the early 1940s, but there's not a good resource for aggregating that and for making it accessible to scholars.
Any other questions? Okay.
I'm glad Steve's out there because I can't see anyone in the audience. I assume there are still people out there.
Yes, we had a couple of classes offered on comics at the University of Texas El Paso, and we bought a fair number of graphic novels to support the curriculum. And what we did was we had added the novels to the main collection, and what quickly happened was many of them started to disappear, and the remaining copies were shuttled off to special collections, which obviously has some pretty strict access rules. Do you have any suggestions for how we could mitigate access in the future?
I often tell my students as I stand in front of them and rip up a book that, you know, my perspective, and I know academic libraries are a different beast in this respect because you are often going for long-term conservation and preservation and this depth of collection that a public library or school library might not need or want. But from my perspective, books are consumables. And although it's not ideal to lay out the money every time something is stolen, I think that we need to be more flexible with that. I also think, too, that this is where library partnerships with publishers, such as what Lisa was asking about, might be a possibility. I think that's something that we need to be investigating more actively as a profession, how we can be of assistance in preserving and making available these resources over time. Because it is true that with a lot of comics, especially when you get into some of the smaller press or mini comics or even some newspaper comics, when they're gone, they're gone. There isn't some, pile of them waiting at Baker and Taylor for you to order from there. So I think it's a challenge. Putting them in special collections isn't the best answer, but I do think that these partnerships moving forward that we could look at with publishers is a potential solution. But in the short and medium term, I guess just trust and figure that if people are stealing them, maybe they really, really need them.
Hello, I think it is. Hello? Oh,
Hi.
hi. I'm Mandy Hurt. I'm with Duke University Libraries, and we have had the Edwin and Terry Murray collection of comic books since 2002, and it's only this year that I've started cataloguing it.
Yes.
So there's also a problem of it's not just getting people to understand the value of comics, but there are no free copies. They would donate it to us, but in order for them to be preserved and housed correctly, we had to wait till we had the money to do that. And I'm now up to about 901 titles catalogued, so we finally took down the library guide.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just interested in what was being said about the books disappearing, and you're talking about making them available.
Right.
That we have things like Action Comics, the first appearance of Superman,
Mm-hmm.
and frankly, nobody's ever going to put that on the shelf. So I suppose what I'm trying to ask in a rambling, roundabout way is, how do you suggest trying to strike that medium between the fact that we have to preserve these materials if we're saying they're of value and access?
So I would say a couple of things. I am very cognizant. Even my own institution received a few years ago a donation of, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 comics, which are sitting in a storage room in the basement. That's my understanding. And the library staff keeps hoping that no one, which means me, will ask about them. Because they're not accessible to the public. They don't know what to do with them. They don't have a workflow and process to get them indexed or cataloged for public access. And I think that those restrictions are very real. If there's only one of you, or there are only two of you, or only half of you, and you have this enormous collection and you have other things that you're responsible for, it's not feasible to suddenly catalog 30 or 40,000 comics or fanzines or related materials. I think one of the things I appreciated about the San Diego State approach, let me go back to this, is that they departed from a lot of conventions in cataloging. They were really more aimed at getting this access out as quickly as possible. And so they were working with students, and students don't cost quite as much as we do, but they were working with students and were able to get up to about 60 records an hour, in part because they were borrowing metadata from the Grand Comics database and other sources. And they were using those sources to augment their traditional record structure. So I think anything we can do along that to look at alternative approaches, to look at even creating websites and digital displays for the cover, providing some contextual information for these comics, getting people enthusiastic about them, knowing that they're there. I think that's a start. It's not a solution, and it will take funding, it will take some creative efforts to move us beyond that. So I don't know that I addressed your full question, but I hope that's a start. Yes.
Hello, my name is Adolfo Tarango, University of British Columbia. So I had similar experience in terms of growing up and comics being a part of my household. But as it was a bilingual household, I also had the privilege of reading some comics from Mexico. One, Hermelinda Linda, which was a satirical comic centered around a character that was a bruja. And another series, Memi Penguino, which was a young black Mexican. But what was interesting about that was my mom's favorite comics. So the appeal to adults was real back then as well. This was in the 1960s and stuff. But more pertinent, I'm curious to what extent you talked about some other foreign language, but I was curious to Spanish language, to what extent those are being used or preserved, or do you know what type of work is being done in terms of that?
Absolutely. I know that there are some Latinx-focused collections, maybe even at El Paso, by one of the Texas universities. And in terms of other library collections in the US or out, I'm not sure about large-scale collections. I think probably, even though Brazil is Portuguese speaking and not Spanish speaking, I think comics culture is rich enough there that there's probably some library efforts in Brazil, but maybe not so much with Spanish speaking Latin and Central and South America. I think that one of the issues that we face is there are some countries like France and Belgium and Sweden which have long-standing and very robust comics cultures and which have been historically a little bit more accepting, the same with Japan. And so there have been efforts in places like that to do more sustained comics collecting. So I can't speak specifically to the Spanish language stuff other than I hope that we can deal with that too. There are comics essentially in every culture and in every language that you might imagine. And some of those are growing. There are some resources online that people are beginning to create. So for instance, there's a recent website that I've become familiar with, which is focused on African comics and African-focused and created video games. And this is not a library-focused site, but it's one of the few ways of finding out about comics and immersive storytelling that is coming from the African continent. So I think we need more efforts like that and find a way of reaching out to colleagues. And again, I think there's too often the lingering perception that this is ephemeral stuff, that it's not meaningful or not important for libraries to deal with. And so I do think that we still need to work on overcoming that as we try to get libraries thinking more about collecting materials from other countries in other language categories.
All right, we've run out of time, so would you join me in giving a warm applause to Carol? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I am simultaneously sad and relieved to report that we are at our closing session now. I just want to remind everyone that we have our evaluation online, and there's information about that in your packet as well. We really appreciate all the feedback you can provide. so that we can make this an even better experience for you next year and years to come. Additionally, NASIG, as I have mentioned many times, is a volunteer organization. So if you would like to get involved with all of this, please fill out a volunteer form. And if you think that there is somebody who should be a part of an elected position, we also have a nomination form. And I know that our nominations and elections and incoming vice president would be happy to have a lot of that from you. I want to say thank you again to our sponsors this year, the American Chemical Society Publications, AIP Publishing, the Rockefeller University Press, Taylor and Francis Group, EBSCO, Springer Nature, Duke University Press, Oxford University Press, Project Muse, Horasowitz, Penn State University Press, SPIE Digital Library, and WT Cox. I want to say thank you to Program Planning Committee, chaired by Steve Kelly from Wake Forest University, and vice chaired by Violetta Illich, as I learned recently, from Northwestern University. And last but not least, thank you to Conference Planning Committee, co-chaired by Danielle Williams from the University of Evansville and Sue Wagon from St. Mary's College. I am nearing my last acts as president, so I have a couple of things I want to say to you all. NASIG has been my professional organization and annual conference since my first year in librarianship. I have been blessed with numerous informal mentors over the years through this organization, and I would not be standing here right now without them. If this is your first time here, I hope you have a similar experience. As I reflect back on the past few days, I find that once again I have a lengthy to-do list and the inspiration to tackle at least one item on it in the next year. Yesterday's talk by April Hathcock has given me ideas of how to approach diversifying our membership and participation. Friday's talk by Michel Demontier has given me motivation to build partnerships with our IT department to ensure that our faculty are properly storing their research data. Today's talk by Carol Tilley has made me want to sneak some graphic novels into our book orders. And as the head of acquisitions, that's one of my privileges. As I'm wont to do, I've attended quite a few sessions on usage data that's given me some ideas and methods and tools for working with my institution's data. So those are the things that I can share when I report back on what I learned. But those are not the only important things about a NASIG conference. It's the hallway conversations between sessions where great ideas are hashed out. It's sharing over a meal in the dine-around where you make a new research partner or friend. Yes, the scholarship aspect is important, but that's only one part of the conversation. It's only one part of the to-do list creation. NASIG has been and continues to be a dynamic community of professionals, including but not limited to librarians, publishers, and vendors, engaging in understanding one another's perspectives and improving functionality through the information resources life cycle. Thank you. And now I have the privilege of introducing to you your new president, Steve Oberg. He has the rare distinction of also being a past president of NASIG. I'm not entirely sure why he agreed to run again, having done this before, but I assume that the passing of time dulled his memory, leaving only the pleasant aspects. Regardless, I am very glad he did. I have benefited from his institutional knowledge, experience, thoughtfulness, and most importantly, I have enjoyed his friendship. Thank you, Steve. I'm looking forward to all of the action items you're going to assign to me.
That's a foreboding. So, one reason that I want to do this is because of people like Anna, who care deeply about the organization, and I'm so happy to be able to present her. Let me turn it around without dropping it again. The official Gavel Award. Can everybody see that? And at the same time, just to thank you so much, Anna, for your leadership, but especially your friendship. And I'm trying not to get emotional. You know, one of the things, let me just say, if you don't mind standing here for a bit longer, this is the heart of NASIG. I didn't know Anna very well until I was fortunate enough to be elected to the board. We had seen each other, I'm sure, in previous conferences. Both of us are a little bit shy, to be honest, but I have come to know her. I've come to know her heart, what motivates her, and we are very different people, but we are very, very good friends. I'm so blessed to call you friend. So I don't want to be sappy, but that's the truth. This is what I love about NASIG. Thank you, Anna. And she gives the best hugs. Seriously. So, again, I just wanted to say a few words and then move to introducing the CPC co-chairs for next year's conference in Atlanta. As Anna said, yeah, I've been around this particular bend before. Is anybody here who was at that conference when I was last president? I'm just curious. Okay, so you might remember the thing that I can't ever get away from is that at that conference, which was at Carnegie Mellon in 1999, yeah, 17 years ago, I wore a kilt. Not anymore. So I wore a kilt then. Today I wear old man clothes. The jury is still out on whether I will do something like that for next year, so that'll just be a teaser for you. So I was in my, let's see here, how old was I? I was in my 30s then. I was single. I had more hair, and it wasn't gray. Today, I'm married. I have 4 incredible children. I have a lot fewer hairs, a lot grayer hairs, and about 40 more pounds. But the thing that doesn't change for me is NASIG in the sense of how much I care about it. This is really, I was telling Carol before her session, NASIG is something I'm passionate about. And the older I get, the more important I think it is that we do things that we love. Carol clearly loves comics. She's terrifically passionate about it, terrifically articulate about it. And I'm very, very passionate about NASIG, and I'm very, very much looking forward to a bright future. As Anna said, please spread the word about NASIG. Please communicate what NASIG is to your coworkers and to vendor colleagues especially, spread the word. One of the things I want to highlight about it is that we sometimes forget what makes us different is that we are a nonprofit organization. That's not true of other peer conferences and so forth. This is a nonprofit organization made up of volunteers who spend inordinate amount of hours devoted to working for the organization. And so, for example, Danielle and Sue and Steve and Violetta with the CPC and PPC, the work that you do is amazing. And with that, I want to introduce and call up to the stage the very privileged people who so kindly agreed to chair CPC for next year to tell us a little bit about Atlanta, Marcia Seaman and Sarah Perlmutter. Oh, okay. Well, actually, good. We've got other people who are on the group. Okay. I'll hand it over to you, Marcia.
Thank you.
So I'm Marcia Siemens. Sarah Perlmutter unfortunately had to go ahead and leave yesterday, so I have a couple of cheerleaders with me. So our conference in 2018 will be in Atlanta. will be at the Grand Hyatt in Buckhead, June 7th to the 10th. I understand the Grand Hyatt is very excited to be hosting NASIG, and the CPC committee members have started talking about it and are getting very excited as well. So Eleanor and Shannon, who are much more familiar with Atlanta than I am at this point, are going to entice you by giving you some of the highlights of some of the things you might do or see in Atlanta.
Alrighty, as two former Atlantans, we're hoping we'll see you down at the Peach State next year. Atlanta, Hotlanta, a city with many nicknames, a city too busy to hate. We hope some of these things will be inspire you to join us next year.
Right. We're just going to give you a few highlights of some of the things that you can expect while you're in Atlanta and possibly get to see. First of all, Atlanta is all about history. History, history. There's Gone with the Wind. There's Martin Luther King's birthplace. There's Center for Civil and Human Rights. There's all kinds of history.
We can't forget, though, a very important thing in Atlanta. There's Coca-Cola, the Fox Theater, the Varsity. We've got Piedmont Park, Little 5 Points, my personal favorite, the Georgia Aquarium.
Okay, we've got the Olympic Centennial Park. We've got the High Museum of Art. We've got Zoo Atlanta. We've got the Braves, baseball, of course. And then there's wonderful nightlife, restaurants, and shopping. There's something for everybody in Atlanta.
We're very excited that the 33rd Annual NASIG Conference will be hosted by Atlanta in 2008. We hope to see you in the Peach State next year.
And we get to a drawing, right?
Yeah.
So I hope you all are now really excited about coming to Atlanta as well. And come, invite your friends, invite your fellow serialists. The last thing we will do is a prize drawing for a conference registration for the Atlanta conference. If you turned in your badge or want to turn it in now, we'll be drawing from those. I believe Danielle is somewhere out there collecting them, or, okay. You really cannot see from up here. I think Danielle will bring them up. See if I can get over here where I can see. Awesome. Okay. I'll take it over. So I think we've just made an executive decision that you have to be present to win. So.
Todd Enoch? Probably not here. All right. We can keep going until, what, you know what? Paul Muller? I saw him. All right! Paul wins. Okay, here. That was good.
Thank you very much, and I'll make sure this gets turned into the proper person.
All right, now we can put up. Yes.
All right, that's a wrap, folks. Safe travels.